Argentina's President Mauricio Macri came to office with a big promise to eliminate poverty in his country.
But not everyone is happy with his approach. So are Macri's reforms the answer to the country's economic woes? I'm Malika Bilal.
I'm Femi Okay, and you're in the stream. 7 months into his presidency, Mauricio Macri is already feeling the heat from controversial economic reforms he says are geared towards getting Argentina back on track. Discontent has been growing for months among Argentines who have seen prices for basic services like electricity and water skyrocket over the year. Macri says his plan is necessary for recovery and that patience is needed to undo the deficits inherited from previous administrations.
But will his policies revitalize the country's economy? Well, to help us talk about this, we're joined by Mark Weisbrot, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. In Buenos Aires, Mark Rogers. He's the editor of the Argentina Independent. And Ivan Petrella is the Secretary for Federal Integration and International Cooperation in Argentina's Ministry of Culture. Welcome to the stream, everyone.
So,
Hello,
Ivan,
thank you.
Just to get us up to speed with what you felt Argentina was like before President Macri took over, can you give us a picture? What was the economy like? How was life like in Argentina?
Yeah, and that's a good question because it puts everything else in context. I mean, Argentina has spent about 5 years in what's called stagflation. That is, a recession, an economy that doesn't grow, and at the same time, very high inflation. We've had one of the highest inflation rates in the world, about 700% inflation for the past 9 or 10 years. And you know, that combo of no growth plus inflation in most countries in the world is considered an economic crisis. I mean, it's very hard to get out of that. Now, and if you add that to the fact that current revelations, and it's all over the press in Argentina, shows that the previous government was immensely corrupt, to the point that, you know, a novelist couldn't make some of this stuff up. Like the ex-secretary of Public Works, you know, hiding bags and bags of millions and millions of dollars of Chinese currency and Qatar currency in a currency in a convent and getting caught red-handed. You see that part of the inheritance includes, on the one hand, you know, a very complicated economic situation, high inflation, recession, an economy that doesn't grow, a central bank practically empty of reserves, plus immense revelations of corruption. It shows you that what we're dealing with in the current government is something that needs to be handled with a lot of care.
Mark.
Well, I think there's another side to this story, of course. You know, the Kirchners were in the government from 2003 and until last year. And so that is President Nestor Kirchner and his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. And that people in Argentina had an enormous increase in their living standards during this period, huge. Okay, he's only mentioning the last few years when the economy grew very slowly. But
can you give us an example? How huge
well,
is huge?
Poverty was reduced by about 70% and extreme poverty by about 80% during their rule. The economy grew. It was one of the fastest rates of growth in the world during most of this time. And so employment hit a record level. People care about jobs, you know, by 2010, even after the world recession. And by the way, I know there is dispute over the numbers for inflation. So when I say poverty is reduced by 70% and extreme poverty by 80%, that's using independent estimates of inflation. That's not the government's numbers, because that's what Mark Rogers might object to. But no, that's using independent estimates of inflation. So by all of these measures, and that's why that government was so popular for most of that time. Now, it is true, they ran into trouble in the last few years, and there were imbalances. There was the inflation, you know, which was in the 20s, and you had also the economy grew slowly for the last few years up to this last election. It grew only about 1% a year. But you look at the economy now, inflation is running for the first 6 months of the year at a 60% annual rate, and the economy is in recession. And a university study just came out. For the first 3 months, 1.4 million people fell below the poverty line. So poverty is increasing, and the economy is quite a mess right now. It's much worse than it was, and the government is I just finish this sentence and then go ahead. Yeah. The government is doing what a lot of people feared, and I wrote about before the election. They're making some adjustments which are necessary, like devaluing the currency, but they're doing it in a way that the burden of it is falling very hard on the majority of people, working people and poor people.
You know, actually, surprisingly, perhaps from what you'd think, I agree with quite a few of the things that Mark was saying. That is, it is true that in the first couple of years of the Kirchner government, poverty actually went down. It went down to the establishment of a series of social programs which were very useful coming out of the huge economic crisis we had in 2001 and 2002. And that's why this government is building upon those programs. That is, at no point in Argentine history have more children, have more families, have more senior citizens received more cash subsidies from the state than at this point. That is, we're building upon those programs which were so successful and which are absolutely necessary. At the same time, I mean, one could get into the numbers that Mark cites, et cetera. People who follow this know that Argentine statistics in the past 7 or 8 years have been all falsified by the government, which is actually quite of a problem, because when you come into government and you don't have statistics, it's very hard to fly a plane when you can't really see where you're going. Now, at the same time, let me add that our focus has been to try to avoid, in these first months of government, the first half of a year that we've been in government, to avoid an economic crisis like those that Argentina has had in the past and like that which Venezuela has today. Because if we followed the route that the country was following until last year, we would very soon be in the same kind of dire straits that Venezuela is in today. And in fact, every economist that was an advisor to the other presidential candidates agree with what Mauricio Macri is doing. In fact, Daniel Scioli, who was the presidential candidate for the Kirchnerista party in the previous election and who we faced in the runoff, his main economist, Miguel Bain, has said that what is being done is what needs to be done, and that the Argentine economy will be growing at 5% next year.
It's safe to say there are people online who also agree that what is being done now is a good thing. I want to read just two comments that we got from people online. So this is one, and you mentioned subsidies there. So one on Twitter, we translated his tweet, he sent it to us in Spanish, says that these subsidized tariffs are an excuse to steal from the state, from us. Populism doesn't distribute, it squanders. So right here is a critique of the previous administration. Another person with that critique, kind of following it up, this is Mariano on Twitter, who says, what we saw were 12 years of short-sighted energy policy that have crippled the Argentine energy sector and therefore stunted economic growth. Mark Rogers, some criticism there for the Kirchner administration. What do you make of it?
I think most people do agree that the policy of subsidies and freezing those tariffs worked in the initial years because the recovery from the 2001-2002 crisis was so important, so necessary for people to be able just to pay basic utilities. But after a period of time, it became unsustainable to maintain these subsidies and maintain these utility tariffs at such low rates, especially compared to other prices in the economy, which were soaring after years of high inflation. And what Ivan said recently is true. The economists and different presidential candidates agreed that these changes and reforms had to happen, but there's a big disagreement in how to implement these changes, and especially how quickly to implement these changes. What the current administration has done has removed very quickly a large amount of the subsidies on water, electricity and gas, and it's caused a huge increase, a spike in bills for many households, sometimes more than 1,000% in these recent months, in the cold months where gas heating becomes increasingly important. And many of these households simply can't pay for these bills. And the result has been that a court has ended up suspending these increases. And now we're in a period of limbo where we don't know exactly how much the increases will be this year, whether there will be more increases before that year is up or in the next year, and how the ordinary workers and families will be able to afford these in the context of stagflation. Another response to something that Ivan said at the start of the program that in most countries, a period of stagflation, of recession and high inflation would be considered an economic crisis. We are in that position right now, with inflation up at nearly over 45% on an annual basis, and growth expected to fall down.
Ivan, repeat that, please.
That's true. Inflation has been in double digits.
Oh, what I'm saying is that we've been in stagflation the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, you know
It's
what, Mark has
now.
several good points, actually. And I actually, would defend the Kirchnerista government for at least one of those tweets. That is, we don't think, quite the contrary, that cash handouts or subsidies to the poorest and most vulnerable sections of the population is populism. We think that's what a government needs to do: care for its most needy, care for its most vulnerable.
So Ivan, let's take an example. I was looking at some of people's Argentines' utility bills, and so, for instance, let's say their utility bill used to be $50 a month, and then it would go up to, say, $350 a month. That is a huge price hike. How is that even sustainable? Where does that extra money come from? I can see how the government would benefit from that, but did you think through how that would in fact impact Argentines?
I mean, you raise a good point, and this is perhaps one of the key dilemmas today, because just to give you 10 seconds of context, Argentina in the past 10 years went from an exporter of energy to an importer. An exporter to an importer. That is, we have an energy crisis in Argentina. We do not have energy. That's something that needs to be understood. We do not have energy currently in Argentina, even though we have reserves, according to the US State Department, for the next 500 years. We can't get that energy because we don't have the investments. So that's one issue. The second issue is, you're right, and Mark is right about this as well, that for some households, the increase in the electricity prices is too high. And that's why
But who could possibly, Ivan, what some households, who could possibly deal with 200% raise?
Surprisingly, many people. Why? Because the subsidies were not targeted to the most vulnerable sections of the population.
Rich Argentines can deal with it. Okay, Malika, what do you have?
Well, it's funny, Femi, you mentioned those bills, so I want to show an example of what that actually looks like, and I'll pass this over to you, Mark. So this is Juan Manuel, who tweeted what his bill looks like. He says, this is a family's house. It's just an oven. There's a stove and a hot water tank, and he puts the price for it there on what it is now. Another person tweets, this is Gabrielle, who says this is the current gas bill. And you can see the price right there. It's about $180 US. He says his last bill was about $20 US. So who is it that can actually afford these? And is it an undue hardship on people?
It's terrible. And, it's actually something they didn't have to do. It's one thing to say, okay, we're going to have a devaluation, and that has to be done in one fell swoop. That's what they did. They had a black market for, for the currency, for the dollar, and that had to be getting rid of at once. This could be done much more gradually. It could be done in a targeted way. If you're going to have a devaluation, even that causes inflation to go to 60%, that's what it's been for the last 6 months at an annual rate, according to the latest release from the central bank. Okay, if you're going to have a devaluation that increases inflation that much, you should protect people. In the United States, we have tens of millions of people that have food stamps. They could have had a food stamp program.
Let me show you something here. President Mauricio Macri, with so many people below the poverty line, every day counts. Doing things in 1 month is not the same as doing them tomorrow. There is no time to do things gradually. That's what the president is saying.
But it's just not true. I mean, the central bank has reserves. Reserves have increased under this government in the last 6 months. So they're not having a balance
because the gas prices and the utility prices have gone up.
They're able to borrow. That was the other thing that hasn't been mentioned. But Argentina had a balance of payments crisis mainly because it couldn't borrow on international markets. Now, I think the government did the right thing by settling with the vulture funds, even though it's a hateful thing to do. They were doing terrible things. They did terrible things to the country. But they settled with them so they could borrow on international markets. Okay, so they don't have a balance of payments crisis anymore. So you don't have to implement these things so drastically that you throw people below the poverty line and you squeeze them the way they're being squeezed.
Evan,
Mark, I think surprisingly that, if we got together and had a cup of coffee, you'd end up working for our government because we tend to agree on a lot of things that I think you don't know that we agree on. I mean, quite frankly, the increase in tariffs and energy prices is highly targeted. We need to remember one thing that hasn't been mentioned here. Take gas, for example, which is one of the main complaints, because it's gone up substantially for some sectors of the population, and we know that, and we're trying every day to work so that doesn't happen again. But only 50% of Argentine households actually have gas connections in their households. So you have 50% of the population who in the previous government were actually not even subsidized, and they relied on buying gas cylinders, which was much more expensive, much more costly, and they weren't covered by the subsidies. What we've done, with great care, as much care as we've been able to do so far at least, is target the subsidies to the Argentine families who are in the lowest sectors of the population.
Let me just bring back in Mark Rogers. Mark Rogers, I'm showing here a tweet from the President Macri, and he's watching football with his wife, wearing a T-shirt. Now, he's wearing layers, but his missus isn't, and she's wearing no socks. It is wintertime, of course, in Argentina. This was June the 26th. So this came out in June the 26th. And then later, maybe about 3 or 4 weeks later, the president was saying, well, maybe you should be more careful with the way you use your gas, your energy at home. Maybe you need to be not walking around in a T-shirt. You should be dressed warmly. That did not go down well with people in Argentina. They felt that he was being a hypocrite. Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. I think it was a highly insensitive thing to say at the current time, just as people were receiving these new gas bills with sometimes shocking increases. The president in the last few weeks has turned the discourse slightly and talked more about the environmental need and the benefits of saving energy, also as a result of trying to use the energy that Argentina has as much as possible and reduce imports of it, which is a legitimate reason, and especially the environmental reason. I completely agree with the president's view on that, and we should be saving energy. There is a culture here of using too much, I believe, and that is partly to do with the abundance of cheap energy in the subsidized tariffs over recent years. However, to say that at a time when people were struggling to pay their bills, with this Twitter picture as well of days earlier, as you said, of the family watching precisely in a T-shirt and not a huge amount of layers of clothing, just shows a detachment from the reality, I think, of how many people and how many households are living in Argentina today. And I think this is a problem that the government has. The government has talked a lot about bringing together a team of experts, of technocrats, many from the private sector, many CEOs, experts in their fields, which makes it extra concerning for people why there was such a blunder in this, how this gas hike was implemented, affecting so many people in such a severe way in the first place. But also the idea that the government has been trying to fight with the whole time is that it's not a government that works for the rich, for the CEOs of the country, for the more
Mark
wealthier
Rogers,
aspects, and for the average Argentine.
What's the president's approval rating right now? I'm just curious. How many people like him?
I believe it's still above 50%, although there are quite wide discrepancies in different polls.
Malika, what do you have?
Yeah, it's still high.
I wanted to show some of what that reaction looks like, because of course he was hammered pretty hard online to the suggestion that people need to save gas or do things that they hadn't been doing in the past. This is a video on Twitter from Fahrenheit. They posted this. Take a look at this.
Hay que consumir, muchachos.
This is people going to a local kiosk. They have blankets, they have candles. They say they're using their body heat and a local drink to help keep them warm. So this is definitely people poking fun. But we also have this tweet from Mariano, who says the president has good ideas but poor implementation. But he admits his mistakes quickly and he corrects, which is refreshing after years of being lied to by the previous administration. Mark?
Well, first of all, I think that if Scioli had won, he would have done a lot of the same things. I mean, every economy has imbalances after it grows for years. I mean, you remember the real estate bubble in the United States that caused the Great Recession when it burst? Okay, that was a big imbalance. So they ran into imbalances as well, and you can criticize the previous government for not having corrected them earlier, but they would, I think, they definitely would have settled with the vulture funds. They probably would have devalued, and so those are the imbalances. The real question is not whether they're correcting mistakes. The question is, how are they doing it, and are they making things worse? Now, clearly, we can see they're making things worse for the majority of people, but they're actually doing worse than that, because the inflation is eroding real wages very rapidly. And so you see, if you look at the GDP and the components of it, you can see that spending on things like food and clothing, the kind of wage goods, has dropped the most. Okay, so that's contributing to the recession. So they can cause
Mark,
a very bad problem that can last for quite a long time.
Your president went to Argentina in March, and he was impressed. Have a look.
President Macri is a man in a hurry. I'm impressed because he has moved rapidly on so many of the reforms that he promised to create more sustainable and inclusive economic growth and to reconnect Argentina with the global economy and the world community.
And then have a look here, and there's more. This is Politico. Argentina is back in the world. This is a lot of kudos here for what Argentina is doing.
Sure,
in 6 months,
sure.
7 months.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something the media never talks about. But this is part of the U.S. foreign policy is a huge part of this whole situation, not only in Argentina, but in South America. Generally, to leave it out is like talking about Ukraine without ever mentioning Russia. One of the things that President Obama, he didn't just go there and lavish praise on the government. He actually unblocked, there was a block on loans from multilateral institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. They tried as well there, to put on by the U.S. government against the previous left government in Argentina.
So isn't that good for Argentina and good for Argentines?
That part, well, not if you see what the government is doing with that. Well, I mean, it's wrong for the United States to be trying to get rid of left governments and replace them with right-wing governments. Yeah, I think that's really wrong.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I think holding on to some Cold War idea, we're in the 21st century. I think especially with the rapprochement between Cuba and the United States, we can put the Cold War to rest. But beyond that, going back to Argentina specifically, one thing that would be hard to explain for people who think that this government is doing everything wrong is the fact that Mauricio Macri's approval ratings today are the highest in Latin America. And that, in fact, and any economist who works in Argentina will know the relevance of this fact I'm about to throw out now. The Consumer Confidence Index of the University di Tella, which is the most important consumer confidence index in Argentina, and usually follows very precisely the result of presidential elections. That is, when a government's consumer confidence index is high, they tend to win. When it's low, they tend to lose. This one that just came out shows that the consumer confidence index went up 7% between July and June. That is, Argentines in their majority are optimistic about the future, because they know that although there's a hard situation that's currently taking place, they're well aware that...
Does that include your opposition?
Well, I mean, this is obvious. Obviously, there's always opposition to any government, but what the consumer index measures is, in general, the feeling of the Argentine population. That is, a majority of people believe they will be better off next year than this year, and that's because they trust in what the government is doing.
This program is in two parts, and the reason it's in two parts is because we were talking about the economic reforms and economic changes in the last 6 or 7 months in Argentina, but there have also been protests and people hitting the streets. That is where we're heading to, and we will keep Ivan and Mark Weisbrot. Thank you very much for being part of this program. We will continue our conversation online, and Malika.
Thanks, Femi. Of course, today was just part one of our look at Argentina. On the next show, people and the protests, like this one on my laptop, this tweet here. We'll look into the impact that these economic reforms are having on those living in the country. We'll see you then.